Welcome to Insider's Inside podcast, where we dissect everything social media. I'm Teodora Lozan, SaaS marketer at Socialinsider, and your host for this show, excited to get into the nitty-gritty of everything social media. I'll talk to social media professionals that work in freelance, in-house for a company, and in an agency environment to get the best of all worlds. Which is a nicer way of saying we'll snoop around and see how others do it. Let's jump in. In this episode, I'm happy to be joined by Ebrahim Shakir, Associate Strategy Director at Ogilvy New York. Ebrahim has been part of the marketing and communication world since 2011 and has worked with some of the biggest brands out there, including Nestle, IBM, and PPG. Lucky for us, he's here to give us some insights into social media marketing through the lens of one of the biggest advertising agencies in the world. So hi, Ebrahim. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
For sure. So I've been currently working at Ogilvy for over 5 years. I've worked across Asia and the US. I used to be in the Singapore office and now I'm in the New York office. My specialty is I focus specifically on digital and social strategy. I help brands understand the different gaps and the different opportunities they have within their ecosystem. And my team with myself, we build it out for them, identify and build out robust strategies that basically help them meet their business goals and the objectives they're trying to reach.
That's really great. How did you start in your career?
So I started off in my career actually in publishing. I used to work for Singapore Press Holdings. So I started off very early there and I tried to understand more of the print world. Back then in 2011, social and digital was still not as strong as it is today. I then moved on to working for a company called Epicenter, which was the biggest Apple reseller in Asia because Apple was not selling in Asia at that time and they needed an official retailer. So my role basically was to integrate online and offline and build their social digital channels from scratch to basically drive sales in offline stores. So that's when I started realizing that I knew I had an inclination towards digital, but that was my first big challenge, trying to build that out across Asia for a company that was dominant on retail sales. And really get exposure to what are the on-ground challenges brands face from the brand side itself, to understand the complexities and the needs of these brands. After that, I spent a couple of years working in startups and I worked in different companies, which I strongly encourage a lot of people to do early on in their career. When you work in new companies or startups, there's a lot of challenges. You're required to wear a lot of different hats. You're expected to do a lot of different things, and that really gives you exposure on what is needed to succeed for a business. And you start to realize that a lot of the principles that a startup needs to succeed tend to also translate to bigger organizations. And you start to learn what I believe is the most critical skill for a strategist is you start to learn how do you simplify complex problems and find solutions for them. And that's how I started off. And then I moved into the agency world and I joined Ogilvy.
So, how was the big leap from a company, from a startup world into a big agency? Because I assume the roles are quite different.
Yeah, that it's definitely a leap. And I think the one advice always that was given to me, and I think it's industry wide, is that when you start off at an agency, it's a steep learning curve. There's a lot of things you need to learn. Agency life is very fast. It requires a lot of dedication and also a lot of passion. And I believe you need to enjoy the work to be at an agency. I felt the leap was big, but it was something I enjoyed. I always wanted to work at Ogilvy. It was one of the first agencies I knew I really wanted to be part of. And I enjoyed the culture. The team I was in was a very, very good team and a team that had a bit of a startup mindset. So a lot of those principles sort of carried over. And when I joined it, it was back in 2015 where social was really booming, but there was still a lot of things we needed to figure out. So even though we were still a giant agency, the team I was in also had to function with a lot of problem solving and figuring things out as we go, just because of the natures of the platforms. And there's a lot of things most brands had not even done yet on social digital. So you're basically operating like a startup and getting brands to try, test, optimize, understand, and learn what we can from the social digital world.
That's an interesting correlation to associated with the startup mindset. What about the move to New York?
So I spent over 3 years in Singapore, and a lot of my role developed into more of the Asia business. And I was very keen to start a new challenge, try something new. After 3 years, I felt I had a bit of that itch that I wanted to explore something new. And I was wanting to try something new, yet I was not yet at the point where I wanted to leave Ogilvy. So the best option was to explore a different market. And I was very fortunate that I had bosses and I had a team that was very supportive in finding those opportunities for me. And they moved me to the New York office. And I was excited because I felt, besides Singapore, which is like the hub of advertising more or less in Asia or Southeast Asia, New York was the advertising capital of the world. So I figured, there's no better place to be in advertising than in New York. So that sort of like prompted a lot of my move here.
Was it hard to adjust to the new market? Are there any similarities?
Yeah, I would say if, especially I can only speak to really my field, for doing strategy. I feel like the core principles are there, and if you have exposure to different markets, I feel you actually at an advantage because you bring different perspectives, you look at it different ways. And I think the biggest thing to realize is brands and companies in different markets function very differently. The mindset of clients are also very different. So if you're able to work in different markets, you understand different mindsets, you also have exposure to different kind of opportunities and problems. So opportunities you might have identified in Asia that no one is thinking about in North America, you can bring that to the table and be like, this is what they're doing there, we should try exploring this kind of thinking, right? And if you're, for example, working in North America, if you go to Asia, it's the same thing, right? Because they're not thinking about what's going on in North America, and you can implement those kind of strategies. I don't think it was tough. I think it was very beneficial to see a very different side and learn. And I think as long as you have a learning mindset that you want to understand and learn from the people, I think I don't think you'd find it that hard.
Doesn't this also bring some extra bottlenecks in communicating with clients?
I wouldn't think so. Again, each market has its challenges. I feel a lot of clients recognize when you have a strong strategy or a strong opportunity for them. I think a lot of it comes down to how you want to communicate and simplify. And that goes back to my previous point. Like, if you're a good strategist, you can make very complex problems simple that help you move along the process and get things where they need to be.
Okay, so after all these experiences, working in an agency versus working on the client side, what are the main differences, advantages, disadvantages? You already said that it's a much faster pace in an agency. What else?
That's a great question, and actually, that's a question I get very often. I would say the biggest difference is you need to figure out what your personality is and what you enjoy. Because at an agency, you tend to get exposure to a lot of different brands. In my time working in Ogilvy for 5 years, I've worked across multiple different verticals, from automotive to education to food and beverage to tech. And the kind of problems each brand face, it's so different. And learning how to work with a new brand, for example, like IBM, you need to learn the full depth of what that company does and understand their product. So that comes with a lot of different understanding. And what that basically means is that if you're someone who likes different challenges and likes to be exposed to different things, and working on potentially one brand might be more boring to you, then agency life is very fun because there's always something new. You never get bored. And if ever you feel like, you've reached whatever you want to reach with one brand, you can always raise your hand up, go move to another brand. That ensures that you're always doing something new. But if you feel like your personality is someone who you like to stay focused, you feel more grounded just working on one brand and really going as deep as you can in understanding that brand and finding those solutions, then working in the brand side might be more beneficial. And I think the second biggest difference also is that when you work at an agency, you tend to have a core function role, right? Like for my role is I work on strategy. So I have the privilege of focusing most of my time is just building strategies for clients. And I enjoy that very deeply and I'm able to do that. But if I, for example, if you go to a brand, if you're a brand manager, a brand director, you have to work on the full spectrum of everything that the brand does, from packaging to strategy to brand to e-commerce, sales to logistics, distribution. So you must be also wanting to do all of those different things, and be aware that that's sort of the biggest difference between an agency versus a brand.
What about any advice you'd have for a newbie? Because getting your foot in the door in one of the top tier agencies isn't really that easy. How can they stand out and get noticed?
I strongly encourage people that you be curious, be proactive, and learn the platforms. Right, there's nothing stopping you right now from, for example, opening up a website to understand how the website works, build ad accounts, spend like maybe $50, put it into all the different ad platforms, and understand how do you build ads, how do you buy ads, what kind of creative do you create, understand the core principles, because in an interview you can talk about these principles. You can sort of show you already have a baseline understanding that you were curious enough to go and explore and learn on your own without having someone come and teach you everything. It shows that you have the right mindset for an agency. The second thing I would say is don't be afraid to reach out to people in agencies. You tend to realize a lot of people who work in agencies tend to be a bit more outspoken, tend to be willing to network, to talk to people. So don't be afraid to invite someone out for coffee or ask someone to be your mentor, or even reach out to them to be asking them for advice on how they could potentially help you.
So that would apply to people looking to work in social media as well, I suppose. Do you have a dedicated social media team?
We do. So for just New York alone, we have a team of over 40 people that specifically work on social and digital. And we span across strategy, data and analytics, influencer strategy, paid media, and then within strategy, there's just a certain different breakouts of media strategy versus brand strategy under the digital umbrella.
Speaking of diversity, then, what does it take to create a successful social media campaign?
Well, that's a tough question. There's a lot of different parts to what makes a successful campaign. What I would say is, to make a successful campaign, you need to have a few things at least. The first one is you need to be extremely clear on what your objective is and what you're trying to achieve, right? Because every brand, every person who's trying to build something on social is trying to achieve something different, right? You could be trying to achieve brand fame where you want people to know who you are, or you could be on the other end of the spectrum and you could be trying to drive sales. All you care about is how many products do you sell specifically on your website. So being extremely clear on what your objective is and what you're trying to achieve sets you up for the right kind of success that you can specifically measure and ensure that you're doing what it takes to get there. Beyond that, everything else comes down to, your creative, your media strategy, all the different elements that mix into your ecosystem, the way you want to build your user journey, and basically how complex or how simple it needs to be based on that objective that you set.
Okay, to narrow things down a bit, it's always important to reach your KPIs and your goals and get those engagement numbers that you want. But is there a point where you think a certain campaign has been a great campaign? Putting aside all of this, maybe you have a project that you've been working on for a long time and it's a really interesting idea and it's unique, but the numbers aren't quite there. How do you approach these situations?
So for me personally, what I deem as a successful campaign is if it's able to drive social change. I believe that if you're able to, one, drive a behavioral change within your audience, and two, if it's a social change, it's a huge added bonus that I personally am a huge fan of. And you see there are campaigns where it shifts the mindsets of people. There was one campaign Ogilvy did where in Brazil they created a song for women to sing in the stadium to speak out against domestic abuse. And it gained a lot of awareness and traction about this being a big topic. You know, in Singapore, I did a campaign once for Nestle where we were bringing awareness of the level of stress and pressure that's being put on kids during their examinations and how it's leading to a lot of very grave consequences, and sort of bringing light to that and making parents understand that encouragement and positive reinforcement goes a lot further. The campaign was Never Give Up, and we did a series of content where we actually interviewed kids and we told them, like, what is going through your mind, like what are you thinking of for your exams, and you hear the raw stress, the raw emotion they have, and the fear and anxiety. And we really brought attention to parents that this is a big issue, and we need to address it, and we need to make the next generation realize that their future is not determined by a single score in an examination. So I do believe, yeah, like a greater measure beyond like business objective is if a campaign can bring about change, and especially behavioral change within an audience.
Going further in the line of campaigns, do you have any pet peeves for social media campaigns and otherwise? Common practices that you see all the time and absolutely hate?
I think that's a tough question because I think sometimes we face a challenge on our own where there's things we disagree with, there's things that we don't like, but that's also the nature of the stuff we need to create. The one pet peeve I would say is, and I mean, I can't say that I have never built work that isn't that way, but that would be that I think the realization that people are on social media because they want to be entertained, they want to enjoy the content, they want to be engaged, right? And every time you build an ad, that's a disruption to their enjoyment of the platform. So when you build an ad that is so far off, it's not what they're looking for.
That's true. Do you have any sort of bullet points or rule book that you always apply when you create a campaign within Ogilvy? Some certain steps that you may always follow?
We do, but I think a lot of it ends up becoming very theoretical, and it's very specific. So one way to frame it is I've always been told, and I also believe this, at Ogilvy sometimes it's like an advertising university. There is a lot of robust frameworks that we build. There's a lot of really senior people who have such rich knowledge of a lot of the crafts within Ogilvy. And for anything that you want to do, there is a principles already there. There are going to be extensive decks that are going to explain the theory and what you need to apply. I don't have at the top of my head like a list of principles, but with every, especially with my time in Ogilvy, there's different principles for everything that you're trying to achieve.
So it's a case by case basis. It's not a general rule book.
Yeah.
Going back to campaigns a little bit, how important is it to adjust to unforeseen events? Especially when it comes to social media, I mean, because we see a lot of brands coming out with a lot of similar messages that might or might not work.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something we face a lot, especially with strategy when we're dealing with different brands and clients. Something I would say on that front is you have to be agile. You have to be flexible enough that when you look at things pivoting, when you look at things that are changing on the spot, you need to be able, in a calm, composed way, to look at the data and sort of understand what is causing this and then make a decision. I always like to call it with my team is you either peer or you pivot, right? You always have these two options ahead of you, and you need to look at the data and you need to make a sound decision to do that. Because a lot of times when something goes slightly wrong, people panic and you're like, okay, let's change the course. But that's not necessarily always the best thing to do, because sometimes, like I give you an example, you run a campaign and suddenly you have, for example, 10 people who have commented on something and being extremely negative, right? And it's very easy to get affected by that and be like, okay, let's pull it down, let's change course. But then if you look at the data and you say, wait, okay, so 2 million people were served this video, out of that, 25% of them watched it till the end. They enjoyed the video. they placed an action that they actually ended up going to a website. They wanted to search more about your brand, and X percentage of them actually, liked the video. But that 10 comments is most visible, but it makes up from of 0.001% of the engagement, right? So if you look at the numbers in totality and you rationalize the 10 comments versus the 2 million people I reached, what is the level of influence and what is the level of percentage does that make up to the larger audience that was sort of influenced by this campaign?
Right.
You see, and make those decisions based on the numbers, the facts, and also the bigger picture, and not get swayed by a lot of smaller things. And if we have time, I have one perfect example of this when Nike ran the ad around it's the one with Colin Kaepernick. When they first ran that ad, basically a lot of people were very upset with the ad and they started burning Nike shoes, right? And if you see at that time, even Nike's stock fell. So that's a huge negative impact to the company. People are burning your product, right? But the team had done all their calculations. They had looked at the data and they had anticipated and they were prepared and they persevered because they knew that even though it went down, people were burning their shoes, the people that they were trying to reach would absorb and understand and advocate for their message. It was tailored for a specific audience, and Nike was confident of who their audience was and what they were trying to do. And the tagline was, believe in something even if it means sacrificing everything. And Colin Kaepernick was also standing for a very specific issue that also was very polarized and very political. And Nike had doubled down on it. They were like, this is what we believe, and as a company, we're going to stand for it. And they knew that people are going to, the people they wanted to influence were going to accept this message. And what eventually happened is Nike sales increased, Nike stock increased way beyond what they were previously, because they realized the large impact is going to be a lot stronger than the smaller impact on even on CNN or on news. People are burning Nike shoes, but they knew that impact is not going to be as much as a larger audience that's going to be persuaded and knowing that this is a company that I want to be associated with. So again, the scales are different, the outcome can be different, but staying the course or knowing when to persevere or pivot, determines a lot of what the end ends up becoming.
So it was really tailored to a specific audience. It wasn't just for everybody.
Right.
So how much did you take into account the social climate? Because we have everything going around with Black Lives Matter, with coronavirus. When does it make sense for brands to acknowledge what's going on, and when should they just leave well enough alone? Because, for example, we have a lot of brands like Toyota, Lexus, and many other big names that put out a lot of ads talking about uncertainty, talking about being together while being apart, talking about being here for you. And that's exactly the problem. They were all saying the same thing, but it's sacrificing some of the originality and the brand personality. Is it a good strategy or not?
You bring up a great point, and that's something that as an agency, there's a lot of factors we need to look into. My personal point of view on that is there's a lot of research that showed that a lot of brands continued running just the usual ads that was not COVID related. So I would split the question, right? I think Black Lives Matter versus the COVID are separate issues, and I think have very separate things involved.
Okay.
So for COVID specifically, the research was showing that a lot of brands that just continued their normal advertising still saw a lot of growth and had a lot of positive outcome. I think the fear for a lot of brands was that they needed to be relevant. They needed to ensure they're not tone deaf. And what ends up happening in that is what we saw, right? All the brands were talking about the same thing. So my point of view on that is think about what is your value to your community and to your audience, right? What are you actually doing to communicate what your brand stands for? So in the case, I think it was Nissan, and in their ad, they said that we understand these are hard times, and because of that, there was a program they announced that you didn't have to pay for your car loan for like 12 months or something like that if you were affected by COVID. So in my perspective, I was like, that's a good ad, right? Because that means that you're not just saying we are there for you, you're showing us how you're there for you. You're doing something, right? Versus an ad that just says, these are tough times and we are there for you, but how are you being there for us? So I feel like if a brand, like I personally then was like, yeah, I like Nissan. Nissan's a good brand. Maybe I will consider Nissan next time, because when times are tough, they came out and they were like, we understand the situation. We are going to be there for you. And I feel like that's doing it right. Um, and I think there's the other side of the coin, where also realizing that if you have as a brand a strong value to give a certain situation, like you can't specifically do something for your audience, it might be better to just run your ads normally, and not say very COVID specific thing. For Black Lives Matter, I think that's a separate issue on its own. I think that's an issue where it needed attention. It's a very important issue, and is the more brands talk about it, the more brands support it, bring attention to it, the more change we're going to see. And I think I strongly encourage. I think it's great when brands use their voice, use their stage, use the platforms they have to support causes that matter. I think that's always a good thing. And I don't have a specific view on if any brand did it in the wrong way.
Okay, so I want to talk about one more specific case and maybe get some more insights from you. Ogilvy put out an interesting paper on what coronavirus means for brands on social media and included some insights about buying behaviors and preferences. Can you tell me about the idea and the strategy behind it?
I think Ogilvy tries to put out a lot of different white papers. I actually had written one of the white papers, which was what would be the change we see, because Instagram was removing likes. The team and I wrote the white paper. I was not part of this specific white paper, so I don't have that behind the scenes knowledge of specifically what was going on with this white paper. But what I can say is there are a lot of elements that was happening, and there was a lot of questions being asked when COVID hit, and how brands needed to pivot their strategy at that time. And what that white paper, I believe, was trying to do was, if I'm not wrong, it was written by one of my colleagues, Renata, and her team. And they did a phenomenal job with that paper, because it got a lot of publicity also, because it very clearly outlined all the different aspects that a brand would face with COVID, and really look at what are the different things you need to start considering when you're building your new strategy to combat this. It helped a lot of brands understand the different things we needed to keep in mind. And it also looked at what are the ways it would make sense to sort of understand what the context is in which we're living in. I did communicate with that team, and I had seen the white paper, and I did help a little bit here and there. But yeah, I think it was a great paper. A lot of brands found it very useful. It was trending on LinkedIn. And I think it did a lot of good use in the early stages, when people were still trying to collate all the information and try to understand what about all the different data and science sort of telling us of how brands needed to behave.
That was going to be my next question. How did you choose the platforms to promote this paper, and how did you manage to reach more people?
That's a good question. So I think a lot of it is, so Ogilvy has its website that has a lot of his white papers, and there's also a lot of very influential people who work at Ogilvy. I personally think LinkedIn's one of the best platforms for thought leadership and pushing out content like this. I myself have seen that, when you push out good content that people really need, and if it's contextual and if it's at the right time, you get a lot of traction and a lot of people want to know more. And it just helps that, at Ogilvy, there's a lot of people who are subject matter experts that can speak to this. And a lot of it is a mix of organic push and just influence people have within those platforms.
I suppose you received responses about the paper managing to bring some help to brands. Anybody actually talking about how the paper helped navigate this crisis?
Yeah, so there were definitely a lot of people who reached out to the team. There was a lot of brands and all. There was also a lot of internal clients that wanted to understand this better, because there was a lot of decisions that needed to be made. I don't have specific examples, but yeah, I think white papers are a strong way, especially if the information is strong, if the POV is good, and the information is helpful.
So does it help secure, sorry to interrupt, does it help also secure relationships and partnerships with clients.
For sure, because the role of the agency also is in times like this to be able to bring that thought leadership to the client, in real time while it's relevant for them to make decision. So it's definitely, very useful for our brands.
Okay, speaking of clients, how do you approach bold ideas with them? I think in Brazil, there was this commercial with this Coke is a Fanta. I think it was also by Ogilvy.
Mm-hmm.
That was launched on International LGBT Pride Day. Pretty much in Brazil, they have this saying, this Coke is a Fanta, to refer to somebody who is part of the LGBT community.
Yeah.
So Coke released a Coke can with Fanta soda.
Yeah.
That to me was an amazing idea, but how do you convince somebody to take part in such ideas?
As in, how do we convince the clients?
Exactly, that they're worth investing in.
So I think it's worth on realizing also is that for a lot of really good ideas and really good campaigns, the relationship the agency has with the clients are very long relationships. Like the relationship of Ogilvy and Coca-Cola, it's a very long one. I worked on Coca-Cola even in Singapore. And I think the way I would look at it is to be able to do big, bold campaigns, you need trust. And trust is only built one step at a time. You're not going to get trust overnight. Ogilvy had a record of doing really bold campaigns for Coca-Cola. The one where people could customize their names on Coca-Cola cans, and those kind of campaigns that Ogilvy did that were really big. And you're looking at a very long partnership, and the trust has been built over, you're talking about 10, 15 years, even more. And when you have that level of trust, when you have a record of delivering bold campaigns for the clients trust you and the clients believe in your ideas too. And it also works both ways because you've been with the client for so long, you know the client better than anyone. The relationship is so strong that it doesn't feel polarized that I'm the agency, you're the client. It all feels you're one team, right? We're all working on this together. So it's a lot stronger to sell in ideas that way.
Yes, of course, and Coca-Cola is also a company that has a history of putting out bold ads. But what about a client that's a little bit more afraid of that?
So that goes back to the same thing, right? You need to slowly build confidence and trust. You do one small campaign and then you gradually build up. It's unrealistic to know a client for like 3 months and sell in a massively bold campaign because the clients also need to know that you understand their brand. And if you have been working on Coca-Cola for 20 years, they know you understand the brand. They know you are going to, this bold idea makes sense because you have understood the brand so contextually and you know it so well.
And they've seen results.
Yes.
I wanted to touch briefly on the subject of client communication.
Mm-hmm.
Because we released a survey a while back, and apparently communicating social media needs and getting clients to understand necessary costs or activities is sort of an uphill battle for more than half of the people who took part in that survey. This brings me to this perception of client versus agency. What do you think about it?
Um,
Or is that obvious on a day-to-day basis?
I think that's an interesting question because I think there's a lot of factors to that, right? A lot of it depends on the size of the client. If you have a client whose budget is like $10,000 and then to convince them to spend all that money on social, it might be hard. If you have a client whose budget is 50 million, who understands very complex ecosystems and knows the channel mix, and you have a media agency that can explain all of it well, social media is not difficult to, in fact, is one of the platforms that most clients are like, that's where I want more of my budget to be. So I think it really depends. It depends on the size of the brand, the size of their budget, the type of clients, the type of product, and what they're trying to do. We have also seen like a lot of clients who have e-commerce built into their platforms put a lot more money on digital just because they can see the revenue they're getting, they can see the sales. So there's so many different aspects, so many different brands. It's hard for me to really give a definitive answer on why this might be the case, but I think it's very subjective.
I think most of the issue with communicating with clients goes around to the notion of we are sort of in a war. It's the client versus the agency all the time. And that's definitely a notion that I don't believe in. And I was wondering if you can tell people what they could do better to improve a relationship with the client.
I would say, I think the few ways you could improve your relationship with your client is one, I think you need to be genuinely passionate about what the client is trying to do, right? I think if you are not passionate about the brand, if you don't care about the product, I think it's clear, right? It's hard to build a strong client relationship. A lot of the brands I've worked on, I have been deeply passionate about the brand, and I make it very clear to my clients also that I want to see this succeed. So when you show that passion, and if you genuinely work with your clients and you make your clients see that you are a partner to them, this is not a transaction. You want to see them succeed as much as you want to see the campaign succeed. You will build a good relationship. And I think, a large part of a good relationship is being able to listen. Like, you need to be able to understand what is the needs of your clients, be able to understand them. I think a very good analogy is a good client relationship is like husband and wife, right? If you don't know what your wife's favorite flower is, if you don't know what they like to eat, and if you don't understand who they are and what they want to do, you're not going to have a very good relationship, right? So it's the same thing with clients and agency. If you don't understand, and if you can't already think 5 steps ahead of what your client is going to want from you, you're not going to have a good relationship. But if you know every single thing, if you know how they think, what they want, where their goals are, and what they want to achieve, you're going to be delivering things to them that they're going to really enjoy, and you're going to have a great relationship with them.
But what about if you see a great opportunity for a special project or an activation for one of your clients, but they are sort of reluctant to do it?
So you need to find out why they're reluctant, and then you need to understand, is there parts of your idea or strategy that have holes? Is there things that you have not thought about that needs to be refined? Because I think the biggest disservice you can do is to think that anything you build is perfect, right? There's obviously going to be different elements that you might not have thought of. You got to address that.
That's true. Okay, so one more small segment here. We have a little fire round in which I'll be laying out 2 or 3 terms or scenarios related to social media, and you need to choose one that think is more appropriate, and of course give this answer as fast as possible. So, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter?
LinkedIn.
TikTok for brands, yay or nay?
Yay.
YouTube for brands?
Yay.
Client knows best or client education or convincing?
Client education.
Repurpose content or original post?
I'd say original post.
Boosted post, story ad, or ads in Explore?
That's tough because it really depends on what you're trying to do.
Client versus agency or compromise?
That's a tough one too. Compromise?
Taking a risk or following set in stone and safe guidelines?
Taking the risk.
Bold messages or conservative posts?
Both.
Keeping your distance from competitors or occasionally working together?
Both. You can do both.
Managing client expectations versus bold pitches?
Bold pictures.
That's really interesting. I think it's a good sum up of our discussion. As a last question, is there anything I should have asked you but didn't?
I think maybe the one last thing I would add is, I am always a firm believer that if anyone is watching this and wants advice on their career, I think always pick something that you feel like you're going to enjoy, especially the early parts of your career. Don't look at titles or money. Look at what you feel you're going to enjoy and are passionate about. Because I always believe success is measured with, if you wake up every day and you enjoy the day you're going to have ahead and look forward to it, that it's you being successful.
That's it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it and learned something new about what it means to work in top-tier advertising agencies. I hope you found Ebrahim's story inspiring and gathered some great advice out of it. You can find Ebrahim and the Ogilvy team on social, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn with the links below. And of course, you can also find the Socialinsider team as well. Don't forget to check out our blog for more social media info and database findings. Until next time, keep an eye on those insights.